I'm now back at Woking Mixed Traction as a driver, and on my second day I was booked route refresher, signals, signing on at 10 a.m. and travelled in the cab with driver Ray Reid. I was also booked signals the rest of the week, but on the Thursday ASLEF had called for strike action, so I didn't go into work and helped my brother instead. I still had to refresh my memory on a lot of routes and was booked signals to Portsmouth the following week, but that was interrupted by another day's strike action on the Tuesday. However, on the Thursday I did go to Portsmouth Harbour with my old regular driver in the steam days, Stan Harms. It was nice to be back with Stan again, putting the worlds to right, and it felt quite strange being in the cab with someone else, as it had been a lonely existence being in a cab of an EMU at Effingham for the past year. For the next 3 weeks I was again booked signals, going to Alton and Eastleigh, and also back over routes I'd not been over for a long time. Guildford to Waterloo via Aldershot and Ascot, and from Ascot to Reading, and because I was now back at a mixed traction depot, I had to refresh my memory on routes over non-electrified lines such as Guildford to Red Hill, Three Bridges, Tunbridge, and also Guildford to Reading and Basingstoke to Salisbury. As I'd only been away from diesel traction for a year, it wasn't deemed necessary for me to have a refresher course on Cromptons or Class 73s, so it wasn't long before I was working the various turns worked by this form of traction. I'd already had a Rep and 350 shunter course before my transfer to Effingham, so that wasn't necessary either. I'd also sold my Norton Commando. This was bought by Ian Newell, who was the son of Jim Newell, a fellow driver at Guildford. I'd borrowed a few bikes from friends for rides out occasionally, Brian Davis's Kawasaki 500cc triple and Bill Scott's Honda 500cc 4, but thought that the time had eventually come for me to settle down to four-wheel transport. In December 1974, I thought that the only way I would convince myself was to apply for my driving test, and I had a bit of a shock when the letter came back saying the test was 5 days later. I contacted BSM Driving School and they fixed me up with 4 crash course lessons and I passed first time. I'm sure though that my years of motorcycling experience helped tremendously. My first car was a Mini and it felt quite strange driving with passengers and having conversations. Quite alien to what I've been used to on the bikes. It wasn't long though before I decided to buy my first sports car. This was a teal blue MGB GT and was a wonderful car to drive. George Langhorne, a friend of mine that worked at Maranello Concessionaires at the time, gave it a respray in the oven there and it looked fantastic. This was to be my mode of transport for the next few years. Apart from the stone trains and engineered trains that were regular turns at the depot, there were also a number of freight turns. At North Camp there was a small oil terminal and that train would arrive at Guildford from Ripple Lane. We would then work the train, usually with a Class 73 electro-diesel over to North Camp. There were always considerable excitement displayed by the Guildford Yard shunters with a lot of shouting, "The tanks are coming, the tanks are coming," as if everything else became unimportant. As the load was quite heavy, considerable amps would be drawn whilst climbing the bank towards Pink's Hill, and care would need to be exercised under electric conditions, especially where there were gaps in the conductor rail. At that time, North Camp had a level crossing with barriers, and there would be considerable delay to traffic when propelling the tanks back over the crossing towards the stop blocks. Unfortunately, one of our drivers was propelling the tanks back a little faster than he should have been, and one of the wagons, fully laden with fuel, went over the buffer stops and punctured one of the depot's main fuel tanks. The fire brigade were called and emergency procedures were immediately put in place, cordoning off the area and even evicting residents from nearby homes. Luckily, the fuel tank that was ruptured wasn't holding high-octane fuel. Another one of our regular freight turns was from Aldershot to Norwood Yard via Red Hill, this being an evening turn, returning in the early hours of the morning. I already knew the route to Red Hill but had to learn the route from Red Hill to Norwood Yard and also Selhurst Depot, just in case we needed to change locomotives or replenish the fuel tanks. The Class 33 Crompton hauled train was normally loose coupled with a fitted head of vacuum-fitted wagons to give a good brake force, which was necessary when working over the Surrey Hills to and from Red Hill. This next photograph shows the top deck part of Woking mess room, and it looks like there's a PN break in progress. From left to right, Woking drivers Lou Aldridge, George Lynham, John Burr and Bernie Nibbs. The next photograph shows driver Bill Brain as he exhales cigarette smoke from one of his roll-ups and exchanges banter with fellow Woking driver Brian Pickett. The room's resident teapot can be seen on the table in the foreground. The door led out to a room containing the notice cases and to the washroom and toilets. This was to be my place of work for the next 13 years. The next set of photographs feature Farnham and its yards. Farnham starting signal and Farnham signal box are shown in the distance, always an awkward place to perform shunting. An engineer's trolley is in the upsiding. Farnham outer home signal, and to the left of the photograph the carriage sheds. Unofficial lifts to the station would be conducted from this foot crossing, and if you needed to be picked up, a waving of a rolled up newspaper to attract the attention of the driver on up train from Alton would most certainly be a necessity. The driver of Class 33/03300 conducts a shunt movement from Farnham Tip. This was just one of many places where dirty ballast, spoil that had been cleaned from the track bed by a ballast cleaner, was deposited. Class 33/03320 returns from Farnham Tip with a string of empty wagons to Farnham Up Yard under the supervision of Steve West. With an autumnal mist in the air, Class 73/1 number 73111 stands at Waterloo with the 2252 service to Southampton on the 14th of October 1977. An autumn evening at Eastleigh catches Class 33/1 number 33113 absorbing the sun at the rear end of 4TC unit heading for Waterloo on the 16th of October 1977. An empty stone train hauled by Class 33/0330029 emerges from St Catherine's Tunnel outside Guildford on its way to Woking Yard. St Catherine's Chantry Chapel is perched on the sandstone outcrop through which the Crompton has just emerged. This was built in the 14th century. Blue and grey slam door stock bound in this scene at Waterloo. 4 BR Design 2 EPBs leave on a round-the-world Waterloo-Windsor to Waterloo main working via Richmond and Kingston, while a 4 SIG brings up the rear of an arriving train, probably from Reading. On the far left, a Class 33 locomotive lurks in the long remove yard, which became the Eurostar terminal, whilst a Class 73 locomotive stands in number 2 dock between platforms 11 and 12. Apart from the usual freight that we'd worked from Woking Yard to Aldershot and Farnham, one of the regular turns that ran 2 or 3 times a week was to Aldershot Government sidings. The sidings were situated on the up line between Aldershot and Aldershot North Junction and were operated by a ground frame. The train was marshalled at Aldershot, and the Aldershot shunters, Frank King, Bill Paget or Danny Curley, would accompany you to the sidings and operate the ground frame once your train has passed over the points. The train was then propelled back into the siding, with the shunter closing the ground frame points to allow normal traffic to pass. Before any movement was made across the road to the field stores, the shunters would have to stop the traffic by displaying red flags. The field stores area was quite large and had platforms with covered canopies. In the Great War, horses and troops were loaded into trains and departed from here to the front. On one occasion, whilst at the field stores siding, my second man Nigel Cummins and I noticed an old leather medicine ball laying near the track in the sidings. One of the seams had split, but thinking that it would be an invaluable aid for keeping us mixed traction men fit when standing spare in the mess room, we decided to take it back to Woking. Nigel and I had quite a bit of fun with it on the train when travelling passenger back to Woking, and it stayed in the driver's mess room for some considerable time before ending its days on the skip. Between 1975 and 1985, the M25 motorway was under construction, and one of the many obstacles in its path was the railway line that ran between Chertsey and Virginia Water. In order to allow a suspension bridge to be built that would carry the line over the roadway, The railway track was diverted away and then back to join up again with its original connection. A curvature of the track was made that went to the right for 200 to 300 yards and then curved back to the left and joined again with the original line. Because the roadway was going to take 2 or 3 years to complete, the alterations and the curvature demanded a 20-mile-an-hour speed restriction to be imposed, later termed as a temporary speed restriction. Although drivers were warned about the speed restriction alterations in a periodical operating notice, PON, and the weekly operating notices, WON, it wasn't deemed necessary to mark the area with temporary speed restriction boards. One of the early turns that had been introduced at Woking at the time was a staff train that ran between Basingstoke to Staines and return. It left Basingstoke at around 04:30 am, and a Woking driver would relieve the previous crew at about 0500 and complete the turn. It was the first time that I'd been rostered the turn, and having relieved the Basingstoke driver, I set off from Woking. The electrical multiple unit that I was driving was of the 2-hat variety, and as the guard's van was at the London end of the train, the guard rode in the cab with me for company. After we left Chertsey, my guard asked me if I'd like some coffee, and proceeded to get a flask out of his bag. I had turned the cab light on so we could see what he was doing, and after he'd poured out the coffee, I said to him that I needed to extinguish the cab light as I needed to look out for the deviation and speed restriction. As I turned out the light, the train lurched to the right, and then after a couple of seconds lurched to the left. The guard's flask and cups of coffee, taken on a mind of their own, spilled everywhere and smashed the vacuum flask in the process. Luckily, the 2-car train stayed on the rails, which was quite surprising as we must have been travelling in excess of 40 miles an hour. Several other incidents occurred at that deviation following my misdemeanour, and because of this, a permanent AWS warning magnet and warning board were placed at each end of the deviation. On Monday the 16th of January 1978, I was booked to attend Southside Training School Waterloo for a Class 47 Brush Type 4 diesel electric course. This was of 5 days duration, classroom and static, with a couple of practical handling days during the week. This was termed a conversion course, as all attendees had already passed an examination on a diesel course of some description. The exam was held the following Monday, 23rd of January, when I had to make my way to Southampton to meet the examining instructor, Cyril Sweet, who had taken charge of the train at Poole earlier that morning. I took charge of the train from Southampton to Basingstoke, which only necessitated stopping the train at Winchester and Basingstoke, which was farcical when I think about it now. I then got out of the driver's seat and another driver took the train to Reading. We then went down to Reading Depot and were asked a few questions about the locomotive and were then sent home. A couple of weeks of other mixed traction turns went by before I was booked my first brush turn, 28th of January, and this was a ballast turn, Special 107, signing on it 0018 with second man Dave Morgan. We were also booked the turn for the rest of the week, rest day off on the Saturday. I loved working on the Brush Type 4 locomotives. They were extremely powerful but did have certain drawbacks. There was a bulkhead behind the driver's seat which made it difficult to drive in the opposite direction, as you had to lean out of the cab window so far. Another drawback was that it had very restricted clearance when walking through the engine room. In fact, I'd always change ends via the ground rather than walk through. The locomotive's engine room was also a very oily place, and we were even issued a long dark blue cotton coat as protection. Finally, the cabs were quite draughty, and you'd notice masking tape would be stuck around the gaps to try to seal out the draughts. However, the driving controls were great, and with very good forward vision through the front windows. They weren't dual control though, so it was difficult to perform shunting manoeuvres without a second man present. Some of the locomotives even had a slow speed control switch in the cab, which was quite handy if you were laying stone with a ballast train and wanted to keep to an even speed between 1 to 3 miles an hour. There were other creature comforts too, such as a urinal in the engine room. Just goes to show how the male species dominated the footplate scene in those days. However, one day whilst using the urinal to relieve myself, I didn't notice that the drain pipe had a fracture in it, and I consequently ended up with a wet trouser leg. This photo shows a driving cab of a Class 47 brush type 4 locomotive. Evidence of peeled masking tape can be seen around the joints in the driver's desk. Controls are 1. Steam heating pressure gauge, 2. Amp gauge, 3. Brake pipe pressure gauge, 4. Speedometer, 5. Vacuum brake gauge, 6. Brake cylinder pressure gauge, 7. Main reservoir air pressure gauge, 8. Main brake valve, air or vacuum, 9. Straight air brake, locomotive only, 10. Warning lights, engine wheel slip and fault, 11. Two-tone horn, 12. AWS reset button, 13. Power controller, 14. Master switch, and 15. Master key. In my mind, the best jobs at Woking with this locomotive were the cross-country turns from Reading to Portsmouth Harbour and vice versa. You signed on at Woking, passed to Guildford, relieve and work the Manchester-Liverpool train to Reading, relieve and work the Liverpool-Manchester train from Reading to Portsmouth Harbour, stopping at Guildford, Havant, Portsmouth and Southsea High Level and Portsmouth Harbour. You were then booked your break, in which time the locomotive was shunt released and placed on the other end of the train. You'd then relieve the driver and work the train back to Reading, stopping at Portsmouth and Southsea High Level, Havant, Guildford and get relief at Reading. You nearly always had a good run, both ways, so maximum speed over the route was often attained. The next two photographs were taken at Guildford. First, the driver looks back for a guard's right away before leaving Guildford with the 0805 Portsmouth Harbour to Manchester cross-country service, headed by Class 47 Brush Type 4, number 47107. The second shot, from Yorkeys Bridge, shows Class 47 Brush Type 4, number 47322, as she heads away from Guildford towards Pinks Hill Bank with the 0805 Portsmouth Harbour to Manchester service, after carefully negotiating the up main to down Reading crossovers 20 mph speed restriction on the 14th of June 1983. A couple of family shots here. First shows my brother David standing next to Class 47 Brush Type 4, number 47592, County of Avon at Portsmouth Harbour, upon my arrival from Reading with a cross-country service. The second shows my nephew Jonathan visiting me in the cab of Class 47 at Guildford before I depart from Reading with a cross-country service. The next series of photographs shows some of my work colleagues at Woking. Doug Dunstall, George Mickey, Lou Waldridge, Alex McClymont, Tony Shannon and Martin Peakle. Les Mills, 2 o'clock cover. This sofa was a comfort to anyone on the cover duties. Charlie Holter and Jim Soule. Eric Clark on his last day of work before retirement. Dave Champion, Pat Kinsella, Charlie Hampshire and Mick Sparrow, and Ian Coles. Ian was a real entrepreneur as regards bargain merchandise that he'd acquired at various sales. So long as you bought a dozen items at a time, Ian was the man to do business with. The following photograph shows Les Mills at his leaving do at Woking Railway Club, surrounded by his workmates. From left to right, Graham Redrup, Alex McClymont, Les Hayden, Les Mills, Ray Bartlett, Doug Dunstall and Brian Cobbett. This group photograph shows a retirement party at Woking Railway Club with a Woking contingent, whom most of which I worked with whilst there. Back row, Fred Garnham, Alex McClymont, Mick Lockyer, John Berriman, Ray Bartlett, Jim Lester, Ron Baird, Chris Berriman, Alan Ackhurst, Barry Foster, Dave Hewson, Mark Taylor, Frank Saxby, Bill Flayhive, Terry Butwell, Ian Verinder, Alan Johns, Sue Kinching, Ernie Nibbs, Len Boxall, Alan Hughes, Steve West, Lou Waldridge, Colin Watkins, Alan Nichols and Derek Gain. The front row seated are Dave Jackson, Dave Newbury, George Mickey, Pat Kinsella, Terry Aylesbury and Bill Tickner. The next set of photographs were all taken from twin bridges at Woking. The first shows Class 33/2 Slim Jim Crompton with a possible van train to Clapham as it waits for the road in Woking Downyard long-siding. Only 12 of these locomotives were built in this form for the narrow tunnels on the Tunbridge to Hastings line. The second photograph is Class 33/0 33028 as it hauls a string of high-fits and open wagons of various designs from Woking Yard bound for Eastleigh Yard on the 17th of June 1978. The third photograph shows a Basingstoke Waterloo semi-fast service headed by Forvet 7832 kicking up the snow as it approaches Woking on the 31st of December 1981. Replacing the scheduled Class 50, this Waterloo Exeter service is in the more reliable hands of a Class 33/0 Crompton as it departs Woking on the 31st of December 1981. Finally, with the BAT, British American Tobacco Building, dominating Woking's skyline, Class 47 number 47118 gets a road on the down fast with a Ripple Lane Micheldever Elf Oil Terminal train on the 30th of December 1981. Here are some more photos of Woking drivers and seckermen, all of which were at the depot in the 1980s. David Gray and Dave Barnes, Dennis Copus, Jack Callow, Jim Parker, Ken Earl, John Burr, Fred Ringer, Tony Morton, Frank Saxby, Ian Verinder, Ray Bridger, Derek Ansell, Doug Stent, Alan Mansbridge, Terry Aylesbury and Jack Ward. I can remember a couple of incidents involving plate layers that were working on the line between Winchester and Eastleigh. The first was when I noticed a gang of workers some way ahead of me, so I sounded the two-tone horn as a warning of my approach. The workers moved to a place of safety, but as I watched them from my cab as I approached, I noticed that they were all picking up pieces of ballast and frantically throwing them at an object that was propped up against a running rail. As I got nearer, I could see what they were aiming at, a fish plate. Too late to stop, I bore down on the offending fish plate, and as I went by, the guard iron on the front of my train hit the fish plate, which rebounded under the first coach of my train, making several metal against metal noises. Luckily, my train didn't suffer any effects and I continued on my way. The plate layers had obviously completely removed the fish plate for its annual inspection and left it propped up against the running rail. History doesn't relate to whether it was damaged beyond replacement after my train had hit it. The other occasion of plate layers working alongside the line was again when working a passenger service to Bournemouth. This time the men were cutting down some small trees alongside the line. As I approached, a tree they were cutting fell straight across the forefoot in front of my train. There was nothing I could do but wait for the inevitable crunching sound as branches being chopped to pieces by the front of my train as I hit it at speed. Luckily, I was driving from the train from the TC unit and not from the rep unit, as I'm certain we would have sustained damage to the shoe gear. When I ran into Bournemouth station, the shunter came up to me and asked me where I'd collected all the camouflage. The front of my train still had branches and foliage wrapped around it. Sometimes it was necessary to conduct drivers of plasmatic on-track tamping machines, mostly working at night, as they didn't know a particular route they were working over. Some had an open-fronted cab, so it was imperative to wear warm clothing, especially in the winter months. There was also a track recording machine made by Matisse and got the nickname Neptune because of the trident logo carried on the back of the cabs. Their principal purpose was to record track defects, and they sprayed out red or yellow coloured paint to mark the track at sites requiring attention. They assessed gauge, line levels and cross levels that could then be matched up to previous records to identify areas of deterioration. Approaching Woking, Class 33/0 number 33019 heads a fuel tank train on the 29th of May 1979, a lengthy string of mostly 36-ton tanks in the twilight of their operating years. This photograph shows Class 73/1 number 73135 hauling the cement empties from Northam Yard to Northfleet Cement Works on the 20th of July 1979. Woking drivers were rostered a return working of this train, and with each wagon being 102 tonnes loaded, you had to be very careful driving under electric conditions with traction motors pulling high amps. A good knowledge of where the conductor rail gaps were situated was also necessary. Train services to London were seriously disrupted on Friday the 23rd of February 1979 when the 1313 Hampton Court to Waterloo 8-car electric multiple unit passenger train, after making its scheduled stop at Thames Ditton, was driven past the branch exit signal at Danger onto the up slow line. At the same time, the 1220 from Alton to Waterloo 8-car electric multiple unit passenger train was passing its speed. The Hampton Court train struck the rear three cars of the Alton train, and the leading car of the Hampton Court train was diverted down a steep embankment with its trailing end, to which the second car remained attached, some 12 feet above the ground. The rear six cars of the train remained on the branch line. The Alton train came to a stand with the seventh car derailed and the trailing bogie of the rear car detached. The rear two cars struck and demolished the brick parapet of Angel Road underbridge, which crashed onto the road below. Luckily, nobody was passing at the time, but the roofs of several houses adjacent to the line were damaged by flying debris. The emergency services were quickly called by a householder beside the line, and 30 ambulances were soon on the scene, but only one passenger and the crew of the Hampton Court train and 4 passengers of the Alton train were taken to hospital suffering minor injuries. All were discharged after treatment. The guard of the Alton train was also slightly injured. A 5th person travelling on the Alton train suffered injuries which he did not report until the next day. All the main lines, as well as the Hampton Court and Cobham lines, were blocked following the collision, but normal services were resumed at 12:20 on the 24th of February, and the Hampton Court line was restored by 4 a.m. on the 26th of February. The accident report concluded that the driver failed to look at signal WA75 and assumed that it was displaying a green aspect, as it most often did when he drove on the branch line. Having made that assumption, it was natural for him to assume that signal S39 was displaying a proceed aspect, so he allowed his attention to be distracted by a thrust boring machine which was working beside the railway, when he should have been looking at the signal above it. He alone was entirely responsible for the accident. Although signal S39 was fitted with AWS equipment, the 8-car train, consisting of 2 4 subunits, 4662 leading and 4628, was not. This type of stock was due for withdrawal when the Class 508 was introduced later that year. Had AWS been fitted on this train, it would have prevented this accident. The next 2 photographs were most likely Woking turns. First, a Class 33/0 locomotive heads a long red in Red Hill parcels train, seen here leaving Ash. And the second shows 4 VEP 7800, seen between Ash and Womber on a Waterloo Ascot Guildford service. 4 SIGs were the usual stock on these workings. The site of Ash Junction signal box can be seen on the left of the photograph. The original line to Effingham Junction via Ash Green and Tongham was removed in the early 1960s. Some more examples of Woking mixed traction work. Firstly, with shunter Ginger Patterson hanging on the handrail, the driver of Class 73/0 number 73005 shunts a goods yard at Guildford circa 1980. This scene wasn't to last much longer before the whole of this area became a vast car park. The second photo shows Class 73/1 number 73116 as it rushes through Warburton Station with a special charter on the 25th of February 1979. Finally, 4 Sig 7425 passes through North Sheen with a Waterloo to Reading fast service. As a keen gardener, I always admired the fine crops that were grown on the allotments that ran parallel with the railway line. However, one does wonder whether the brake dust from the trains improved the flavour,